the quiet force, who redefined American manhood before he became a legend. Before the squint and the sneer, before the world came to know the man with no name, Clint Eastwood was just a lanky kid from Depression-era California born Clinton Eastwood Jr. on May 31, 1930, in San Francisco. His early years were far from glamorous. Raised amid the economic turbulence of the Great Depression, Clint's family moved frequently as his father, a hard-working steelworker, struggled to find stable employment. From a young age, Eastwood learned the value of perseverance, the virtue of silence, and the strength of doing rather than saying. That quiet, self-contained nature would later become his trademark both on screen and off. He once reflected, "Growing up, then you didn't complain, you got up and got it done. That never left me." After high school, Eastwood drifted through a string of blue-collar jobs. He worked as a lumberjack in Oregon, a hay baler, a lifeguard, and even a gas station attendant. But fate intervened in the form of a draft notice during the Korean War. Stationed at Fort Ord in California, Eastwood served as a swimming instructor. It was there that he began mingling with aspiring actors and filmmakers, unknowingly stepping onto a path that would change cinema history. The Rawhide Ride. By the late 1950s, Eastwood landed a role on Rawhide, a TV western that would become his first taste of stardom. As Rowdy Yates Eastwood wasn't the lead, but he commanded the screen with his tall frame, steel gaze, and effortless swagger. The audience noticed. Soon, so did Hollywood. But it wasn't until he crossed the Atlantic that he would truly become a cinematic force. The Man with No Name. In the mid-1960s, an Italian director named Sergio Leone was crafting a new kind of Western gritty, operatic, violent, and morally gray. Leone cast Eastwood in A Fistful of Dollars for a few dollars more and The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly. These so-called spaghetti westerns didn't just reshape the genre, they redefined what a Western hero could be. Eastwood's character, known only as the Man with No Name, spoke rarely but acted decisively. He wasn't the righteous cowboy in a white hat. He was something darker, edgier. An anti-hero who did the right thing, but only on his terms. The American audience, fatigued by post-war idealism and entering a more cynical cultural era, responded with awe. He didn't need to explain himself, Eastwood once said of the role. That's what made him dangerous and kind of liberating. With a poncho slung over his shoulder and a cigar clenched between his teeth, Eastwood became a global symbol of masculine cool. The trilogy's success launched him into superstardom and gave him the leverage to take risks on his own terms. Dirty Harry and the Rise of the American Vigilante. In the 1970s, Eastwood brought his brooding presence from the Wild West to the streets of modern-day San Francisco with Dirty Harry. As Inspector Harry Callahan Eastwood portrayed a cop who ignored red tape and took justice into his own hands. It was raw, controversial, and perfectly timed. With a .44 Magnum in his hand and a stare that could stop a man, Cold Eastwood delivered what would become one of the most quoted lines in movie history. You've got to ask yourself one question. Do I feel lucky? Well, do you, punk? Harry Callahan was no noble sheriff. He was the product of a chaotic urban landscape where rules had eroded and moral clarity was a luxury. For some, the character symbolized right-wing authoritarianism. For others, he was the last honest man in a decaying world. Eastwood didn't care which side of the debate people landed on. I was more interested in what the audience saw in him, he later explained. Whether they admired him or feared him said more about them than about Harry. With lines like, "Go ahead, make my day." Eastwood became the face of rugged masculinity and conservative law and order sentiment, embodying a character who operated by his own code in a world of moral ambiguity. The one film he still refuses to watch. Clint Eastwood has spent over 6 decades crafting a legacy that towers over Hollywood like a lone cowboy on a distant ridge. From The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly to Unforgiven and beyond, he built his empire on stoic silences, simmering glances, and dusty revolvers. But even legends have chapters they'd rather leave unread. For Eastwood, that chapter is 2 mules for Sister Sarah, the 1970 Western adventure he filmed alongside Shirley MacLaine, a film he not only disowned but refuses to re-watch to this day. "It just didn't sit right with me," Eastwood once said tersely in a rare mention during a retrospective on his early Westerns. And those few words carry decades of disappointment, creative frustration, and personal discomfort. At the time of filming, Eastwood was perched on the edge of transformation. He had just catapulted to international fame with Sergio Leone's iconic Dollars trilogy, and Hollywood had taken notice. Two Mules for Sister Sarah was pitched as his next big American breakthrough, an offbeat Western that mixed action revolution and a bit of off-kilter humor. Directed by Don Siegel, who would later helm some of Eastwood's most successful films, Dirty Harry Escape from Alcatraz, the project seemed on paper to be a perfect fit. But behind the scenes, Eastwood quickly felt he'd wandered into a misfire. At the center of his unease was his co-star, Shirley MacLaine, a sharp-witted, fiercely independent actress known for speaking her mind and challenging authority. While MacLaine thrived on exploration and improvisation, Eastwood was a man of instinct and economy. He didn't believe in overthinking a scene, he believed in presence. And MacLaine's methodical, often confrontational style clashed immediately with his laid-back intensity. She wanted to talk about everything. Every line, every scene, Eastwood once told a biographer. "I just wanted to shoot the damn thing and move on." The atmosphere on set, according to crew members, was tense. Arguments over blocking tone and interpretation broke out frequently. MacLaine allegedly pushed Siegel to reconsider dialogue and scenes, while Eastwood simmered quietly, preferring to keep his opinions to himself, or, as he would later admit, to his journal. One entry simply read, "Hell of a long ride with the wrong mule." But the acting wasn't the only thing that left Eastwood cold. As production continued, he grew increasingly disillusioned with the story itself. What started as a gritty mercenary tale devolved in his eyes into something farcical. The twist that MacLaine's character believed to be a nun was actually a prostitute in disguise struck Eastwood as gimmicky and insulting to the story's integrity. "It felt like a joke that went on too long," he said in one late interview. "We were telling a story about war revolution survival." And then it turned into a punchline. Eastwood, who preferred the moral ambiguity and grounded violence of his spaghetti western roots, felt the film lacked the bite and seriousness he was drawn to. Siegel's attempt to blend comedy and action resulted in a tone Eastwood found awkward and inconsistent. Despite Siegel's later work with Clint on much grittier material, Two Mules would remain a sore spot in their collaborations. But perhaps what Eastwood disliked most wasn't on screen at all. It was what the film represented. In 1970, he was still an actor for hire, shaped by directors, nudged by studios, and not yet in control of his creative path. He hadn't yet made Play Misty for Me his directorial debut, or taken the reins of his own cinematic universe. Two Mules for Sister Sarah stood as a symbol of artistic constraint, a time before he had earned the right to say, "This is how I want to tell a story." Looking back years later, Eastwood described that period as a time when I knew what I didn't want, but didn't know how to fight for what I did. He rarely, if ever, includes Two Mules in retrospectives, and it's conspicuously absent from most of his commentaries, even as he's spoken warmly about far more obscure works. When asked during a Q&A in the early 2000s if he'd ever watch the film again, he simply shook his head. "No need to. I lived it once. That was enough." Shirley MacLaine, for her part, has acknowledged the tension but laughed it off in interviews. "Clint and I were oil and water," she quipped during a 2010 talk show appearance. "I liked to swim in the deep end and he liked to stay on the shore." But even she admitted the film was a strange little Western. To fans, Two Mules for Sister Sarah remains a curiosity, a mid-career anomaly in an otherwise consistent run of genre-defining films. It has its defenders, and some critics argue it deserves more credit for trying something different. But for Eastwood, it will likely remain the single entry in his Western canon he'd prefer to erase. "It wasn't me," he once said bluntly. And maybe that's why I've never watched it again. I wasn't ready then to say what I needed to say through a film. I am now. And with that, the dusty road behind Two Mules for Sister Sarah is one Clint Eastwood never intends to walk again. An auteur in the making. Never content to remain solely in front of the camera, Eastwood transitioned into directing and quickly established himself as a powerhouse behind the lens. As the dust of the American West settled behind him, Clint Eastwood refused to rest on the laurels of his stoic screen persona. The man who had spent the 1960s and 70s defining masculinity with a narrowed gaze and a steady trigger finger had another calling, one that would change not only the course of his own career, but of American cinema itself. I knew I didn't want to just be a hired gun forever, Eastwood once said. I wanted to tell stories, my stories. That moment arrived in 1971 with Play Misty for Me, Eastwood's directorial debut. A tense, psychological thriller about a radio DJ stalked by a fan, the film was a sharp left turn from the dusty trails of the West. But it worked. Audiences and critics alike were caught off guard in the best way possible. Suddenly, Eastwood wasn't just a cowboy or a cop. He was a filmmaker with something to say. A director with range and restraint. Over the next 5 decades, Clint Eastwood would prove himself not only prolific, but astonishingly versatile. He could still bring the grit. High Plains Drifter and Pale Rider showed he hadn't hung up his spurs, but his filmography soon bloomed far beyond bullets and blood. In The Bridges of Madison County, Eastwood portrayed a lonely National Geographic photographer opposite Meryl Streep. The film was tender, meditative, and emotionally raw, qualities many thought foreign to the man who once snarled, "Do you feel lucky, punk?" And yet, it was this emotional breadth that would become his strength. By the 2000s, Eastwood had developed a distinct style behind the camera, minimal, efficient, and deeply humane. He was known for shooting quickly sometimes in just 1 or 2 takes, and favoring natural light, allowing performances to emerge organically. As Morgan Freeman once put it, Clint trusts the actors. He doesn't direct with a whip, he whispers. This quiet confidence led to some of his most powerful work. Mystic River earned 6 Academy Award nominations. But it was Million Dollar Baby that truly confirmed Eastwood's greatness as a director. A heartbreaking tale of a female boxer and her reluctant mentor, the film earned 4 Oscars, including Best Picture and Best Director for Eastwood, then 74. "I just wanted to tell a good story," Eastwood said at the Oscars, "and let the audience decide what it means." But he wasn't finished. Unforgiven and the Deconstruction of a Legend. The turning point in Eastwood's directorial journey arguably came in 1992 with Unforgiven. More than a Western, it was a reckoning. Eastwood played William Money, a retired killer lured back into violence. The film didn't glorify gunplay, it mourned it. The cowboys weren't noble. The heroes weren't clean. It was a harsh, sobering meditation on what violence costs the soul. Critics hailed Unforgiven as a masterpiece, and the Academy agreed. It won 4 Oscars, including Best Picture and Best Director. For Eastwood, it was poetic justice. The genre that made him a star now bowed before his artistic vision. The war years and beyond. In the mid-2000s, Eastwood turned his lens to War Flags of Our Fathers and Letters from Iwo Jima, both released in 2006. The latter, told entirely from the Japanese perspective, was a daring act of cinematic empathy. War doesn't have a hero. It just has survivors, Eastwood said during press for the film. Letters was a haunting human portrait of those on the other side of history's most devastating conflict. The film earned an Academy Award nomination for Best Picture and was praised for its boldness and compassion. He followed with more tales of fractured masculinity and redemption. Gran Torino, American Sniper Sully, and The Mule, proving again and again that age had not dulled his edge, only sharpened his insight. In each film, Eastwood explored aging, regret, sacrifice, and legacy. He wasn't playing invincible heroes anymore, he was confronting their cost. Politics, principles, and the man behind the camera. Though famously associated with conservative ideals, his 2012 RNC speech to an empty chair remains unforgettable. Eastwood has always resisted strict labels. As mayor of Carmel by the Sea from 1986 to 1988, he promoted environmental conservation, championed the arts, and famously made it legal to eat ice cream on the sidewalk, a rule that had somehow stood for years. When asked about his political leanings, Eastwood responded simply, "I'm for individual rights. I believe people should be left alone to make up their own minds." His libertarian streak has defined much of his life both politically and artistically. He makes the movies he wants to make on the terms he chooses. No fuss, no fanfare. A legacy etched in stone. The honors have come in droves: the Irving G. Thalberg Award, multiple Academy Awards, Golden Globes, and Lifetime Achievement recognitions. The French Legion of Honor in 2007, the AFI Life Achievement Award. In truth, no shelf could hold everything he's earned or deserves. But Eastwood has always remained modest. "I'm just a guy who got lucky," he once said, and kept going. In a town obsessed with reinvention, Clint Eastwood has never needed to change. He simply grew deeper, wiser, more quietly formidable with every passing decade. As an actor, he gave America its most indelible anti-heroes. As a director, he gave cinema some of its most honest truths. And through it all, he remained unmistakably himself, stoic, sharp-eyed, and always walking just a few paces ahead of the pack. A Marriage in the Shadows. It was a cold December day in 1953 when a 23-year-old Clint Eastwood stood at the altar with Maggie Johnson, a soft-spoken secretary from an auto parts company. They had met earlier that year on a blind date arranged by mutual friends. She was poised, elegant, and believed in his potential long before Hollywood ever took notice. He had this quiet confidence Maggie would later reflect in a rare interview. Like he knew something big was coming, even if no one else saw it yet. At the time, Eastwood was still far from the icon he would become. His acting prospects were uncertain, and the couple lived modestly scraping by while Clint took on odd jobs between auditions. Maggie supported them both emotionally and financially as her husband struggled to break into an industry that often ignored him. Building a life in the shadows of stardom, their early years together were marked by resilience. Eastwood eventually found steady work on the hit television series Rawhide in the late 1950s, and from there things took off. But with success came distance. As the rugged star of Sergio Leone's Dollars trilogy in the 1960s, Eastwood's fame exploded overseas. Women adored him. Studios courted him. He was no longer just Maggie's husband, he was an international symbol of masculinity. The couple bought a home in Pebble Beach, welcomed their son Kyle in 1968, and 4 years later, daughter Allison. On the surface, they had built the perfect Hollywood family. But cracks had long formed behind the scenes. Eastwood, never one to play by the rules, lived by a different code off-screen as well, while Maggie raised the children and maintained their home. Clint frequently worked on location, sometimes for months on end, and rumors of affairs began to swirl. One source close to the couple said Maggie knew. She always knew, but she also believed in loyalty even when it hurt. The Slow Unraveling. By the late 1970s, the strain was undeniable. Clint's affairs were no longer whispered secrets. Relationships with actresses and stuntwomen, some long-term, others fleeting, filled gossip columns and occasionally made headlines. Though Maggie and Clint remained legally married, they were largely living separate lives. He had begun a relationship with actress Sandra Locke, a woman he cast repeatedly in his films, and with whom he shared a deeply complex and ultimately volatile connection. Still, Maggie held on. Some said it was for the children. Others believed it was simply her way. Dignified, private, unwilling to let the public see her pain. The final split. In 1984, after over 30 years of marriage, Maggie Johnson and Clint Eastwood separated. The divorce would take several years to finalize, and when it did, it was one of the largest settlements in Hollywood history at the time. Reports estimated the figure between $25 million and $30 million, staggering for that era. A figure reflective not only of Eastwood's immense wealth, but also the high-profile nature of their union. Yet Maggie never spoke ill of Clint in public, not once. Even in the wake of betrayal and heartbreak, she remained poised. "He's the father of my children," she is said to have remarked when pressed for comment, "and I will always wish him well." Their daughter Allison would later describe her mother as graceful, even when life was anything but easy, while son Kyle, whose jazz compositions occasionally appear in his father's films, maintained a strong relationship with both parents. Clint Eastwood, Roxanne Tunis, and the daughter. Hollywood didn't see. While Clint Eastwood's marriage to Maggie Johnson remained intact on paper throughout the 1960s, in practice it was already under quiet strain. Even before his formal separation from Johnson, Eastwood had been involved in a significant and long-term extramarital relationship with Roxanne Tunis. In 1959, while still early in his Rawhide success, Eastwood met Roxanne Tunis, a striking stuntwoman and professional dancer. She was athletic, poised, and intelligent, an embodiment of quiet strength that matched Eastwood's own stoic energy. Their connection was immediate, and what began as an off-screen romance blossomed into a significant long-term relationship that would last well over a decade. Roxanne understood Clint, one of Eastwood's early colleagues remarked. She didn't ask for the spotlight. She gave him peace. Their affair was conducted discreetly away from the cameras and the tabloids. At the time, Eastwood was not only married but also on the cusp of becoming a global film icon thanks to Sergio Leone's Dollars trilogy. Public scandal could have derailed everything. But the relationship with Tunis was not just a fling, it was enduring, tender, and deeply personal. In 1964, Roxanne gave birth to a daughter, Kimber Linshos and Eastwood. The event was kept almost entirely out of the public eye. While rumors occasionally surfaced in gossip columns, there was no official confirmation from Eastwood or his representatives. Kimber was raised by Tunis in relative obscurity, a decision made to shield her from the harsh spotlight and the controversy that would have followed. For a time, even Kimber's existence was a whispered rumor within Hollywood circles, known perhaps, but never openly acknowledged. Clint Eastwood, ever the master of emotional containment, provided financial support and remained involved in Kimber's life, albeit at a careful distance. "He didn't talk about it," recalled a former associate. But he didn't turn his back either. It was complicated. As she grew older, Kimber would forge her own path in the entertainment industry, not as an actress or a public figure like her father, but behind the scenes as a successful makeup artist and producer. In later years, she would speak with measured grace about her famous lineage, acknowledging both the blessings and the emotional complexities of being the daughter born outside the frame of Eastwood's public life. "I always knew who he was," she once said in an interview, "but I also understood the need for privacy. My mother was strong, and she gave me a good life." The relationship between Eastwood and Tunis eventually ended around 1973. The same year, his marriage to Johnson began to unravel publicly. The overlap between these two long-term relationships wasn't just personal, it symbolized a pattern that would repeat in Eastwood's life, a man torn between public image and private yearning, between domestic responsibility and emotional freedom. Unlike Maggie Johnson, Roxanne Tunis never sought legal recognition or media attention. She remained in the wings, supportive, silent, and content with the role she had played in Clint's life. Even decades later, when Kimber was publicly acknowledged and welcomed into the broader Eastwood family, Tunis remained quietly dignified. The Power Couple and the Secret Lives. By 1975, Clint Eastwood had become more than just a screen legend, he was an institution. With his piercing gaze, iconic Western drawl, and ever-expanding resume as both actor and filmmaker, Eastwood had solidified his place in Hollywood history. But behind the stoic veneer of the cowboy-turned-director, a dramatic and deeply complex personal life was unfolding. That year he entered what would become one of the most visible and volatile relationships of his life with actress Sandra Locke. Their first collaboration, the outlaw Josie Wales, was electric. Locke's steely grace matched Eastwood's intensity frame for frame, and their on-screen chemistry spilled off set in a romance that quickly captured the public's imagination. Over the next decade, Locke would co-star with Eastwood in several films, The Gauntlet, Every Which Way. But Luce and Bronco Billy becoming as much a fixture in his professional life as she was in his personal one. "We were Clint and Sandra," Locke once said. "People assumed we'd last forever." For over 14 years, they lived together in a sprawling Bel Air mansion, playing the role of Hollywood's rugged, self-made power couple. But beneath the polished image, their relationship was complicated by secrets Eastwood kept carefully hidden even from Locke herself. Shadows behind the spotlight. Despite their seemingly monogamous public partnership, Eastwood continued to maintain other relationships behind closed doors. It later emerged that during his time with Locke, he had fathered at least 3 children with 2 different women. One of those relationships was with Jocelyn Reeves, a flight attendant Eastwood reportedly met in the early 1980s. Their affair remained almost entirely unknown to the public, quiet, tucked away in small towns and private encounters far from the red carpets and film sets where Locke stood beside him. In 1986, Reeves gave birth to a son, Scott Eastwood, followed by a daughter, Catherine Eastwood, in 1988. Eastwood never formally acknowledged the children during their early years. On birth certificates, the father's name was reportedly left as declined. Reeves raised both children away from Hollywood, and Scott especially grew up under a cloud of quiet ambiguity about his lineage. It wasn't until adulthood that Scott would openly use the Eastwood name and step into the spotlight himself, carving out a successful acting career with roles in The Longest Ride, Suicide Squad, and Pacific Rim Uprising. "My mom raised me with strong values, and I had to earn everything," Scott once said. "But I've always known who my dad is, and I'm proud of him." Catherine, more reserved than her brother, pursued a quieter path, acting occasionally and writing, but largely avoiding the media glare that followed her famous last name. The breakup heard around Hollywood. The carefully constructed image Eastwood maintained began to fracture in 1989. Locke discovered not only the affairs, but also the existence of Eastwood's secret children, and the betrayal cut deeply. Their relationship ended in a storm of illegal drama and public scandal. Locke sued Eastwood twice, first for palimony and later for fraud, accusing him of sabotaging a directing contract he had arranged for her after their breakup. The lawsuits were settled out of court, but the damage to Eastwood's reputation lingered. In her 1997 memoir, The Good, the Bad, and the Very Ugly Locke, painted a picture of emotional manipulation and quiet cruelty. "He controlled every part of my life," she wrote, "and when he was done, he discarded me." The book was both a catharsis and a reckoning, humanizing Locke and giving voice to the private pain she had endured during those 14 high-profile years. It also changed how many fans viewed Eastwood, not just as the lone, unshakable gunslinger, but as a man deeply flawed in his personal relationships, capable of secrecy and emotional distance that rivaled even his most aloof characters. Late love, public lives, and the final curtain of romance. After the turbulence and tabloid-fueled end of his relationship with Sandra Locke, Clint Eastwood entered the 1990s as both a Hollywood titan and a man seeking renewal. Fresh off the critical and commercial success of Unforgiven, a film that not only revitalized the Western genre, but also earned Eastwood his first Oscars for Best Director and Best Picture, he found himself standing at a professional peak. It was during this powerful resurgence that he met Frances Fisher. Fisher, a talented actress with a stage background and a reputation for intellectual gravitas, met Eastwood on the set of Unforgiven. She portrayed a frontier woman hardened by violence and injustice, an emotional role that demanded authenticity. Off-screen, the pair formed a close bond that grew quickly into a serious romance. "Clint had a way of seeing past the camera into the truth of a moment," Fisher once said in a rare interview. "He brought that to his directing and his life." Their connection, though quieter than the high-octane pairings of Eastwood's past, was built on shared passion for storytelling, for the arts, and eventually for a child. In 1993, they welcomed Francesca Eastwood, a daughter who would later embrace her own place in the entertainment world as an actress and television personality. While Clint and Frances never married, they maintained a partnership that for a time seemed unusually stable for the actor-director. They appeared at film festivals, posed for family photos, and supported each other's projects. Even after their romantic split, the two remained amicable in evolution from the painful ruptures of his earlier relationships. A new chapter. The unlikely marriage. Then, in 1996, in a move that surprised fans and insiders alike, Clint Eastwood did something he hadn't done in over 4 decades. He got married. On March 31, 1996, Eastwood wed Dina Ruiz, a television news anchor he had met during an interview. At 30 years, his junior Dina brought youthful energy, humor, and a fresh sense of modernity to Eastwood's world. The couple welcomed a daughter, Morgan Eastwood, later that year. He had this presence, quiet, commanding, but kind. Dina said in a 2011 interview recalling their first meeting, "I didn't think I'd marry him, but somehow it felt natural." The marriage represented an unusual turn for Eastwood, whose independent image had defined his entire adult life. Suddenly, he was not only a husband, but a father of a young child again in his late 60s. And for nearly 2 decades they seemed to share a grounded domesticity that was rare in Eastwood's storied past. The couple often appeared together at charity events, film premieres, and in 2012 they invited cameras into their world with the reality TV series Mrs. Eastwood and Company. The show, which featured Dina Morgan and even some of Clint's other children, aimed to demystify the man behind the legend. Clint himself only appeared occasionally shy of the reality TV spotlight, but his shadow loomed large over the show's narrative. "He's a great dad," Dina told viewers, "but he's also Clint Eastwood. That's a balance we're always figuring out." The final unraveling. Despite outward appearances, however, cracks began to form. In 2013, Dina revealed that she and Clint had been living apart. By December 2014, their divorce was finalized, bringing an end to Eastwood's last confirmed long-term romantic relationship. The separation was relatively discreet by Hollywood standards, with both parties avoiding scandal and refraining from bitter public statements. Yet the dissolution marked a symbolic end to a chapter of Eastwood's life that had once seemed almost redemptive, a chance to rewrite his legacy as a partner and father. What followed in the years ahead was less about romantic pursuits and more about reflection. Eastwood, now into his 80s and still directing with fierce regularity, seemed to turn his gaze inward, focusing on legacy family reconciliation and cinematic storytelling that examined the human cost of heroism. In this later phase of life, Eastwood often appears surrounded by his adult children, many of whom now work in entertainment in various roles. At premieres, they flank him like a living testament to a complex but ultimately enduring family line. He rarely speaks in depth about his past relationships, but his presence at family events and quiet gestures suggest a man seeking closure, if not redemption. "Time teaches you a lot," Eastwood once remarked in an interview, "about who you are, what you've done, and what really matters." When asked once how he wanted to be remembered, he simply said, "As someone who did what he said he was going to do." At over 90 years old, Clint Eastwood remains the definition of American grit, part gunslinger, part philosopher, all legend.